36 hours. That is how long 170,000 American citizens have before the strongest storm on this planet makes landfall on their island. Super Typhoon Sin Laku, 184 miles per hour. Category 5, a pressure reading sitting beside the most extreme tropical cyclones in recorded history. The National Weather Service issued an extreme severity designation, and when forecasters reach for that word, the models are showing them something that makes experienced scientists go quiet. The news cycle gave it 3 paragraphs and moved on. 3 paragraphs that left out the single port, the single airport, the power grid that is 80% exposed to open sky, the 5,000-mile distance from any meaningful backup, and the communities that emergency communication systems were never built to reach. Add all of that to 184 miles per hour, and you are not looking at a bad storm anymore. You are looking at something far worse than anyone is reporting, and I am going to prove it to you. If you are new here, subscribe and stay close. Because 170,000 Americans are 36 hours from the strongest storm on Earth. Almost nobody is talking about it, and the wind speed is somehow not even the worst part. Tonight I show you what is. Now settle in and let's get into it. There is a monster moving across the Pacific right now, and almost nobody on the mainland knows its name. Super Typhoon Sin Laku. Say it slowly, because in 36 hours, that name is going to mean something very different to 170,000 American citizens who are standing directly in its path. Let me give you the numbers first, because the numbers are where this story gets uncomfortable. 184 miles per hour. That is the current sustained wind speed of Super Typhoon Sin Laku as of the latest advisory data. 160 knots. Category 5 on any scale you want to use. And here is the part that should make you put down whatever you are doing. This is, right now, today, the strongest storm on the surface of this planet. Not one of the strongest. The strongest. The single most powerful tropical cyclone currently spinning on Earth. And it is heading directly for American soil. Not Florida. Not Texas. Not anywhere with a congressional seat that gets wall-to-wall cable news coverage. It is heading for Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, United States territories in the Western Pacific Ocean. American citizens, American soil, and the silence from mainland media is, frankly, astonishing. The National Weather Service has issued an extreme severity designation for this system. That is not standard language. Meteorologists do not reach for words like extreme casually. These are people trained to be precise, measured, and conservative in their public communications. When they say extreme, they mean the models are showing them something that makes experienced forecasters go quiet for a moment before they start typing. The central pressure of Sin Laku is sitting at around 898 millibars. For context, that puts it in the company of the most intense tropical cyclones ever recorded anywhere on Earth. Pressure is how meteorologists measure a storm's power at its core. The lower the number, the more the atmosphere has essentially collapsed inward. 898 millibars is not a storm. It is an atmospheric event. And yet, if you turned on a mainland American news channel today, you would probably hear more about a traffic dispute in a Midwestern city than about the Category 5 typhoon bearing down on 170,000 American citizens in the Pacific. That gap between the reality of what is happening and the attention it is receiving is itself part of the story. We will get to that. But first, you need to understand what this storm actually is, because a wind speed number alone does not capture it. Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands sit in the Western Pacific, roughly 5,000 miles from the continental United States. They are American in every legal and constitutional sense that matters. The people there pay into federal systems. serve in the U.S. military at some of the highest per capita rates in the country, and hold U.S. passports. They are not a foreign country dealing with a natural disaster. They are us. And right now, the clock is running. 36 hours. That is not a long time when the thing coming at you is moving at the speed of a commercial aircraft and carries the energy equivalent of thousands of nuclear weapons released in slow, continuous motion. What makes this moment particularly sharp is that Sin Laku is not weakening. Storms sometimes lose intensity as they approach land, running over cooler water or encountering wind shear that disrupts their structure. Sin Laku is doing none of that. The storm is holding its peak intensity on approach, which means the version of this storm that makes landfall is going to look almost identical to the version sitting in the satellite imagery right now. Category 5, 184 miles per hour, 898 millibars, arriving in 36 hours. How does a storm get to this point so fast? Because Sin Laku did not start like this. 72 hours ago, this system was something far less alarming. And what happened in between those two data points is one of the most fascinating and terrifying processes in all of atmospheric science. Stay with me, because this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Something happened in the Western Pacific over the last 48 to 72 hours that meteorologists have a technical name for, and that name is rapid intensification. But that phrase is so clinical and so mild that it almost insults what actually occurred. Rapid intensification, by official definition, means a tropical cyclone gains at least 35 miles per hour of wind speed within a 24-hour period. Sin Laku did not just cross that threshold. It demolished it. This storm went from a Category 1 system, already dangerous but manageable, the kind of storm that makes you board windows and stock up on water, to a Category 5 monster in roughly 48 to 72 hours. The central pressure dropped by more than 60 millibars. 60. That is an almost incomprehensible collapse of atmospheric stability in a geological instant. To put that in terms that make physical sense, imagine the atmosphere above the ocean essentially falling inward on itself, creating a vacuum that pulls air from hundreds of miles in every direction, spinning it faster and faster around a tightening core. The pressure drop from around 960 millibars down toward 898 is not a gradual slide. It is a freefall. And every millibar of pressure that drops translates directly into more wind, more storm surge, more destructive energy. So what turned a strong storm into a planetary anomaly? The ocean underneath it. The Western Pacific Ocean in this region is running at approximately 29 to 30 degrees Celsius at the surface. That is already well above the roughly 26.5 degrees that tropical cyclones need just to form. But here's the detail that takes this from warm ocean to jet fuel. The warmth does not stop at the surface. The warm water layer extends far below, which means as the storm churns and stirs the water beneath it, it is not hitting cold water. It is hitting more warm water. There is no self-cooling mechanism available. The storm is essentially feeding from a reservoir that does not run dry. The ocean, in this scenario, is not just a passive surface the storm is moving across. It is an active energy transfer system. Water evaporates at the surface, carrying latent heat upward into the storm's circulation. That heat releases inside the storm's thunderstorm towers, driving them higher, driving the pressure lower, driving the winds faster. The feedback loop is elegant in the way that only truly dangerous things can be elegant. Warm water feeds evaporation. Evaporation feeds convection. Convection feeds pressure drop. Pressure drop feeds wind. Wind feeds more evaporation, and on it goes. There is also a subsurface factor at play here that most storm coverage does not even attempt to explain to general audiences. Below the surface, There is a substantial reservoir of anomalously warm water, temperatures running approximately 4 degrees Celsius above normal at depth. This is associated with what oceanographers call a Kelvin wave, a large-scale pulse of warm water that migrates across the Pacific at depth, largely invisible to the naked eye, but detectable by instruments and satellites. When a storm sits over this kind of subsurface heat reservoir, it is not just getting energy from the top layer of the ocean, it is drawing on a three-dimensional fuel supply. And surrounding all of this, wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction at different altitudes, was essentially absent. Meteorologists describe low shear environments as favorable for intensification, which is technically accurate but dramatically understated. A low shear environment for a storm that already has warm ocean water and deep heat content is like removing the last obstacle between a fire and a room full of accelerant. The storm tunnel, as some forecasters describe it, was near optimal. Everything was aligned. Nothing was pushing back. Here is the part that keeps atmospheric scientists up at night. Forecast models struggled to predict how fast this was going to happen. The models knew intensification was coming. They did not fully capture the rate. Rapid intensification in compact, fast-developing storms remains one of the genuine frontier problems in meteorology. Satellite technology has improved enormously. Data assimilation has improved. Computing power has improved. And yet the moment a storm decides to explode, when internal dynamics shift, and the eye wall contracts and the pressure begins to fall like a dropped stone, the models are frequently running behind the reality. Which means warnings arrive for a storm that is already more dangerous than the last official advisory described. That gap between what the models say and what the storm is doing is not a small academic problem. It is a life safety problem. Because the window for action gets shorter every hour that the storm intensifies, faster than predicted. And with Sin Laku, that window is already narrow. But there is something even more troubling waiting underneath the question of the storm itself. Something about the place it is heading that makes this a very different kind of disaster scenario. And it has nothing to do with the wind speed. Guam is an island. This is obvious. But the implications of that obvious fact when a Category 5 typhoon is 36 hours away are anything but obvious. On the continental United States, when a hurricane approaches, the response system has options. Evacuees can drive inland. Supply convoys can roll in from neighboring states. Power utilities can dispatch repair crews from 5 states away. National Guard units can cross state lines. There is redundancy built into geography. There are fallback positions. There is depth to the defense. Guam does not have any of that. The island is 29 miles long and between 4 and 12 miles wide. There is no inland. There is no driving to higher ground that is also shielded from the storm. There is one major airport, and it is the only way in or out by air. There is one commercial port, and it is the only entry point for the bulk cargo that supplies basically everything on the island: food, fuel, building materials, medical supplies. The road network is centralized. The power grid is approximately 80% above ground infrastructure, meaning it is directly exposed to Category 5 winds that will be moving at nearly twice the speed of a fast highway car. When those lines go down, and at 184 miles per hour, they will go down, there is no neighboring grid to draw power from. There is no underwater cable connecting Guam to a backup electricity system in Hawaii. The lights go out, and they stay out until humans physically rebuild what the wind destroyed. This is what infrastructure specialists call a single-point failure network. Every critical system on the island runs through a minimal number of nodes, and those nodes are exposed. One airport, one port, one centralized power system. When any one of those nodes fails, the cascading effects move through the whole system almost immediately. No power means water treatment plants stop. Water treatment plants stopping means fresh water becomes a crisis within 48 to 72 hours. Communications infrastructure fails without power backup. Hospitals run on generators until the fuel runs out. And resupply? The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, stages Pacific responses through Hawaii. Hawaii is over 4,000 miles from Guam. The earliest significant airlift capability arrives hours after the storm passes. The earliest heavy sea cargo arrives days later. In between, 170,000 people are managing with whatever they had stockpiled before the storm hit. This is not a criticism of any agency or administration, past or present. It is a geographic and logistical reality that does not change regardless of who is in charge. Island systems collapse faster than continental systems because they have no distributed fallback. The margin for error is measured not in hundreds of miles, but in hundreds of feet. And when the thing hitting those systems is the strongest storm currently on the planet, the question is not whether infrastructure will fail. It is which infrastructure fails first, and how far the cascade runs before it is stopped. The medical system faces this in a particularly acute way. Guam's hospital infrastructure has limited intensive care capacity, limited surgical redundancy, and, critically, limited ability to receive mass casualty support quickly. After a Category 5 landfall, the injured do not wait for ideal weather to need care. Storm surge injuries, structural collapse injuries, debris injuries, these arrive in the first hours, and they arrive fast. The medical system either absorbs them or it doesn't. An evacuation. Let us talk about what evacuation actually means on an island 29 miles long, with a Category 5 storm arriving in 36 hours. The airports are operating. People are trying to leave, but the number of commercial seats available per day out of Guam is fixed, and it was not designed to handle the emergency evacuation of a significant fraction of 170,000 people in under 2 days. Most people are sheltering in place. And that means whatever this storm does when it arrives, most of the people who are currently in its path will still be there when the eye wall crosses. But here's the thing about Guam that adds a layer to this entire situation that most storm coverage never touches. Guam is not just a civilian community with unfortunate geography. It is one of the most strategically significant military installations in the entire Pacific. And that fact does not protect anyone from the wind. In some ways, it makes the story considerably more complicated. The United States has spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars making Guam one of the most important strategic military positions in the entire Indo-Pacific theater. Andersen Air Force Base sits on the northern tip of the island and hosts strategic bomber operations capable of reaching virtually anywhere in the Pacific or Asia. Naval Base Guam supports submarine operations and logistics that are central to U.S. naval power projection across the Western Pacific. And Guam hosts a Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, THAAD, one of the most sophisticated missile defense platforms on Earth, designed to intercept ballistic missiles during their terminal phase. In purely military terms, Guam is a forward operating base for American power in a region that has become one of the most geopolitically contested spaces on the planet. The military facilities themselves are built to higher engineering standards than most civilian infrastructure. Hardened hangars, reinforced structures, engineered drainage. These facilities are designed with the understanding that typhoons are a recurring reality in the Western Pacific. The military is not surprised by this storm in the sense of physical preparation for its own installations. But here is the paradox that rarely gets discussed. The military's ability to operate on Guam is not self-contained. It is dependent on the civilian systems around it. The civilian power grid supplies electricity to areas and communities that military personnel and contractors live in. The civilian port handles supply chains that the military does not fully duplicate independently. The civilian workforce, Guamanian residents, CNMI residents, COFA migrants, maintains, services, and supports the infrastructure and operations that surround the bases. When the civilian infrastructure collapses, the human network that makes military operations possible on the island does not simply disappear. Those are families, homes, communities, and they are all in the same storm. The military will protect its own assets. Aircraft will be repositioned before landfall, flown to safer locations to wait out the storm. Submarines and naval vessels that can move will move. This is standard operating procedure, and it happens routinely before major typhoons. But what the military cannot do is make the storm miss the island. And what military engineering cannot fully solve is the civilian infrastructure fragility that surrounds the bases on every side. There is also something almost philosophically dissonant about the situation. Guam is a location that the United States government considers important enough to station thermonuclear-capable aircraft, ballistic missile defense systems, and Pacific Fleet submarines. It is, by the military's own assessment, a cornerstone of American power in the most strategically important ocean on the planet. And simultaneously, it is an island whose civilian power grid is 80% above ground, whose entire population depends on a single commercial port, and whose distance from the mainland means that meaningful federal disaster response arrives in days rather than hours. The island is simultaneously one of the most important places in American strategic thinking, and one of the most exposed to exactly this kind of event. There is no simple resolution to that tension. It is structural. It is the product of decades of decisions made across multiple administrations for reasons that each made sense in isolation. But when a Category 5 typhoon is 36 hours away, the tension stops being abstract. And what we are about to explore is not just how this storm formed, it is why the ocean itself has become capable of producing events like this with increasing frequency. Because Sin Laku is not an accident of weather. It is an output of a system, and that system has been changing. The Western Pacific Ocean is, right now, behaving like a compressed spring. The sea surface temperatures along the track that Sin Laku followed during its intensification phase were running at approximately 29 to 30 degrees Celsius. That number is worth sitting with for a moment, because the standard threshold for tropical cyclone formation, the baseline minimum, is roughly 26.5 degrees. Sin Laku was not forming over an ocean that barely qualified for storm development. It was forming over an ocean that exceeded the threshold by 3 to 4 degrees. The environment was not just permissive, it was aggressively favorable. It was, in the language of atmospheric science, an overqualified intensification environment. Think of a storm as a heat engine. It takes thermal energy stored in the ocean and converts it into mechanical energy, wind, rotation, pressure gradient. The efficiency of that engine depends on the temperature difference between the fuel source, which is the warm ocean surface, and the heat sink, which is the cold upper atmosphere. The wider that gap, the more energy the engine can extract per unit of fuel. In the Western Pacific right now, both sides of that equation are running in the storm's favor. The surface is hot. The upper atmosphere remains cold. The temperature gradient is steep. The engine runs efficiently. More heat goes in. More wind comes out. But what truly separates a storm that reaches Category 5 from one that peaks at Category 3 is not just the surface temperature. It is the depth of that warm water. And this is where the Western Pacific situation becomes genuinely alarming. In many ocean regions, a powerful storm will churn the water beneath it and pull up cooler water from depth. This cooling feedback acts as a natural brake on intensification. The storm literally undermines its own fuel supply as it spins. This is why many storms weaken before landfall, even over warm water. The ocean underneath them cools. In the region where Sin Laku intensified, that brake did not engage. The warm layer extended far enough below the surface that even as the storm stirred and churned, it kept encountering warm water. The natural self-limiting mechanism of tropical cyclone intensification was simply not available. The storm found no bottom to the fuel tank. Ocean heat content, the total thermal energy stored in a column of water, not just at the surface, is increasingly recognized as the more accurate predictor of storm intensification potential than surface temperature alone. And the heat content values in the Western Pacific this season have been well above historical averages in the regions that matter most for storm development. The ocean is not just warm, it is warm through its volume, in a way that represents a different category of threat than a warm surface over a cold substrate. Now, here's where I want to be precise with you, because this channel does not speculate irresponsibly. The scientific literature on the relationship between warming ocean temperatures and rapid intensification frequency is still developing. Researchers are observing patterns, more frequent rapid intensification events, higher peak intensities in certain basins, expanded geographic ranges for extreme storms, but the exact causal mechanisms, the precise degree of attribution, and the statistical projections forward are genuinely uncertain. What we can say, observationally, is that the Western Pacific right now is a loaded system. Whether that loading is permanent, temporary, or cyclical depends on processes that we are still learning to measure properly. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of problem, because you cannot prepare for what you cannot quantify. There is something else feeding this system, though, something that operates on a global scale, and that was already in motion months before Sin Laku formed. And once you understand it, this storm starts to look less like a random event, and more like the predictable output of a planetary mechanism. The El Niño Southern Oscillation, ENSO, is one of the most powerful climate drivers on Earth, and most people know it as the thing that makes California rainy or produces droughts in Australia. What fewer people understand is that ENSO does not just affect weather. It restructures the ocean. The current ENSO state shows a positive anomaly in the Niño 3.4 index region of approximately 0.6 degrees Celsius. That is a modest positive reading, not a strong El Niño, not La Niña, but a system in transition. And transitions are where things get strange. Transitions are when the accumulated heat that was stored in one place begins to move. The mechanism is called a Kelvin wave, and it is one of the genuinely underappreciated actors in the story of how storms like Sin Laku are born. A Kelvin wave is not a surface wave. You cannot see it from a ship or a satellite image of the ocean surface. It is a subsurface pulse of warm water, an eastward propagating bulge of thermal energy traveling along the thermocline, the layer of the ocean where temperature drops sharply with depth. These waves can carry above average heat anomalies of 4 degrees Celsius or more, and they travel across the Pacific over the course of weeks to months, largely invisible until their effects appear at the surface or begin interacting with atmospheric systems passing overhead. The delayed coupling effect is what makes this particularly relevant to storm forecasting. The subsurface warm anomaly arrives first. The atmosphere does not immediately know it is there. Then, gradually, the warmth works its way upward. Sea surface temperatures begin to rise. Heat flux into the atmosphere increases. Atmospheric circulation patterns respond, sometimes weeks after the ocean signal was first detectable. This lag creates a window where the surface temperature data looks normal, or only slightly elevated, while the actual energy available to a passing storm system is far greater than surface measurements alone would suggest. This is not a theoretical construct. Forecasters and oceanographers tracking Sin Laku's intensification environment would have seen the subsurface anomaly in the data. They would have known that the apparent sea surface temperature understated the true energy available. But knowing that information and being able to precisely predict how fast a specific storm will extract that energy and convert it into wind speed, those are different problems. The data tells you the fuel is there. It does not always tell you exactly how fast the engine will run. What the ENSO transition context adds to the Sin Laku story is a sense of scale. This is not a storm that formed in a random patch of warm water. It formed at the intersection of multiple global-scale oceanic anomalies, a subsurface heat reservoir delivered by planetary circulation, and an atmospheric environment that offered essentially zero resistance. Multiple large-scale systems aligned simultaneously to create conditions that were almost laboratory perfect for extreme tropical cyclone development. The storm did not beat the odds. The odds were already loaded in its favor before the first thunderstorm cluster appeared on satellite imagery. And there is one more dimension to this intensification story that deserves its own careful examination. Because even with all the data, all the satellites, all the supercomputer models, and all the accumulated knowledge of modern atmospheric science, forecasters were still running behind this storm's development. That is not a failure of individuals. It is a frontier problem in science, and it is a problem that has very real consequences for the people sitting in a 36-hour countdown right now. There is a strange irony sitting at the center of modern meteorology. We have more data about the atmosphere than at any point in human history. We have geostationary satellites providing continuous infrared and microwave imagery of every tropical system on Earth. We have reconnaissance aircraft flying directly into storm cores, dropping instruments that measure pressure, temperature, humidity, and wind at multiple levels simultaneously. We have global numerical weather prediction models running on some of the most powerful supercomputers ever built, ingesting millions of data points and producing forecasts that, for track prediction, where a storm goes, are genuinely impressive. A 5-day track forecast today is roughly as accurate as a 2-day track forecast was 30 years ago. And then rapid intensification happens, and the models frequently miss it. Not always. Not catastrophically wrong every time. But consistently, at the frontier of what the models are asked to do, predict the rate of intensity change in a compact, fast-developing storm over a period of 12 to 24 hours, there is a gap between what the models say and what the storm does. Sin Laku's explosive development was another example. The models anticipated intensification. The rate of that intensification, the speed of the pressure drop, the timing of the eye wall formation at peak intensity. These are precisely the things that push beyond current predictive capability. Why? The failure points are several, and they interact. Internal eye wall dynamics are one of the most important. As a tropical cyclone intensifies, the eye wall, the ring of extremely intense thunderstorms surrounding the calm eye, can contract. When it contracts, it spins faster, like a figure skater pulling in their arms. This process can be rapid and nonlinear, meaning small changes in initial conditions produce large changes in outcome. Small errors in the model's representation of the initial storm structure can cascade into large errors in intensity forecasts hours later. Microscale moisture feedback loops are another problem. The distribution of moisture at very small scales inside a developing storm affects convective intensity in ways that global models, operating at grid scales of several kilometers, simply cannot fully resolve. You would need to model every individual thunderstorm cell to capture the process perfectly, and that is computationally impossible at operational scales. Vertical wind shear, which we discussed as a favorable factor for Sin Laku, because it was low, its microvariability matters too. Regional patches of slightly higher shear, or slight directional changes at specific altitudes, can temporarily disrupt the storm's organization, or, conversely, allow it to become more organized than a smooth shear average would suggest. The model sees the average. The storm experiences the texture. The ocean-atmosphere coupling problem ties everything together. The storm and the ocean are exchanging energy continuously, and the exchange rate depends on the state of the sea surface, wave height, spray generation, air-sea temperature difference at the micro scale. These interactions happen at scales below what any operational model currently resolves. The result is a forecast that captures the broad strokes. Yes, the storm will intensify significantly, but misses the fine print. No, not this fast. The operational consequence is exactly what you would fear. Warnings improve in accuracy as a storm approaches because there is more observational data to constrain the models. But the window for action shrinks at the same rate. For a rapidly intensifying storm on a 36-hour approach, by the time the models have converged on a confident intensity forecast, it may be too late to meaningfully change the logistical situation on the ground. Preparation decisions were made hours earlier, based on the earlier, lower forecast. That mismatch between the forecast catching up and the preparation window closing is not a bug in the warning system. It is a fundamental physical constraint, and it is part of why this storm is more dangerous than the headline wind speed alone communicates. History has something to say here, because this is not the first time these islands have faced this kind of moment, and the historical record is not reassuring. The Northern Mariana Islands have a memory that most of the mainland does not share. Super Typhoon Yutu made landfall on Saipan and Tinian in October 2018. It was the strongest storm to ever hit U.S. soil at the time of landfall, a Category 5 with maximum winds comparable to Sin Laku's current intensity. The destruction was not metaphorical. Structures that had stood for decades did not stand through the eyewall. Power infrastructure was destroyed so completely that full restoration took not weeks, but months. Thousands of people were left without functioning homes. The economic and psychological damage to the CNMI community was documented extensively by residents who described the experience as civilization being reset to an earlier state almost overnight. You wake up in the 21st century and you go to sleep in something much older. Go back further to December 2002, and Typhoon Pongsona struck Guam with winds that triggered island-wide infrastructure collapse. Tens of thousands of people were without power for extended periods. The port and airport systems were disrupted. The recovery stretched into months, not weeks. Residents described a surreal disconnection, living on American soil, holding American passports, and experiencing a recovery timeline that would have been considered unacceptable on the mainland. Then Typhoon Mawar in May 2023. Mawar was a near miss by the strict definition. The eyewall did not make a direct landfall on Guam's most populated areas with full force, and it still produced $3.6 billion in damage. A near miss. $3.6 billion. The infrastructure that absorbed that near miss is now being asked to absorb Sin Laku's direct hit. This progression is not coincidental noise. Each major storm leaves a mark on infrastructure that does not fully heal before the next one arrives. Power poles replaced after Pongsona were there for Mawar. Buildings repaired after Yutu are there for Sin Laku. The recovery intervals between major typhoon events in this region have, in some cases, been shorter than the time required for full infrastructure restoration, which means the system approaching each new storm is starting from a slightly lower baseline than it would have in the absence of the previous events. Infrastructure fatigue is not a metaphor. It is measurable. It shows up in the condition of materials, in the economic capacity of the community to fund repairs, in the psychological state of a population that has been through this before and knows what is coming. Sin Laku arrives not just as a single storm, but as the latest in a sequence. And there is a real sense in which the question being asked of Guam and the CNMI right now is not just, can you survive this storm? But, can a repeatedly struck, geographically isolated, under-supported system keep absorbing events at this intensity? The answer to that question is not a meteorological one. It is a structural one, and the structure is showing its age. Every system has a breaking point, and the easiest systems to break are the ones with no redundancy. Guam's infrastructure is a study in minimalism that works perfectly well under normal conditions and becomes catastrophically vulnerable under extreme ones. The single commercial port at Apra Harbor handles the overwhelming majority of all goods entering the island: food, fuel, construction materials, medical supplies, vehicles, everything. Close the port, and the supply chain for 170,000 people stops. Full stop. There is no alternate port. There is no secondary facility to reroute cargo. There is one door, and when Sin Laku passes through it, that door may be impassable for days. The airport sits in a similar position. Antonio B. One-Pat International Airport is the island's sole connection to the air transportation network. It is the way evacuees leave before the storm, and the way emergency responders and supplies arrive after it. It handles both commercial traffic and military logistics. Under Category 5, winds and the storm surge that accompanies them, airport operations cease. Runways flood. Ground equipment is secured or destroyed. The terminal itself, built to resist tropical weather, faces winds that have not previously been seen at this intensity at landfall in the island's modern history. The power grid, 80% above ground, faces the most direct exposure. Transmission lines, distribution poles, transformer equipment, all of it is sitting in the open air waiting for 184 miles per hour winds to arrive. Underground electrical infrastructure survives Category 5 storms in ways that above-ground systems simply do not. Underground is expensive. The cost-benefit calculation made sense for decades in a region where most storms were manageable, and the full economic cost of extended power outages was treated as an acceptable actuarial risk. Sin Laku is the scenario where that calculation gets repriced in real time. When the power goes out, and to be clear, not if, the cascade begins almost immediately. Water treatment requires electricity. Water storage is finite. 48 to 72 hours after a power outage of sufficient scale, fresh water availability starts to become a crisis-level concern. Hospitals switch to generator power, and generators have fuel supplies measured in days rather than weeks. Communications infrastructure, cell towers, internet systems, emergency radio relay equipment either has battery backup measured in hours or depends on generator fuel that is also finite. The ability to coordinate a disaster response, to communicate within the island, to request specific assistance, degrades at the same time that the need for all of those things increases sharply. It is a cascade. Each failure enables the next one. Power enables water. Water enables sanitation. Sanitation enables public health. Communications enable coordination. Coordination enables response. Remove the first link, and every link downstream is immediately under stress. That is the architecture of a single-point failure network under catastrophic load, and it describes exactly the situation Guam and the CNMI are entering in the next 36 hours. Continental Americans do not often think about their infrastructure in these terms, because they do not have to. When a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, neighboring states send crews. Power companies from a dozen states pool restoration resources. Supply convoys move on interstate highways before the storm has fully passed. The redundancy in continental infrastructure is so embedded in the system that most people never notice it exists until they find themselves somewhere it does not. 36 hours sounds like a long time until you try to move a population. Traditional hurricane preparedness frameworks in the continental United States assume a preparation window of several days, typically 3 to 5 days from the time a storm enters the Gulf of Mexico to the time it makes landfall in a worst-case scenario. That window allows for staggered evacuation, supply pre-positioning over multiple days, staged deployment of emergency personnel, and the iterative refinement of response plans as forecast confidence increases. The system was designed for that timeline. It works reasonably well for that timeline. Sin Laku's approach to Guam compresses everything. 36 hours is the preparation window for a storm that has already reached Category 5 intensity and is not weakening. The evacuation that can happen in 36 hours is the evacuation that is happening right now, and it will not be complete before the storm arrives. The supply prepositioning that can happen in 36 hours is whatever was already in position before this advisory, because new supply chains from Hawaii cannot reach the island in that window. The emergency personnel who can be staged for response are the ones already on the island, because meaningful reinforcement airlift requires landing rights at an airport that will be closed by the storm before additional forces could arrive in sufficient numbers. The psychological dimension of this timeline deserves attention too. Emergency managers, local officials, shelter coordinators, hospital administrators, they are all making decisions under extreme time pressure with incomplete information, knowing that the consequences of those decisions will be measured in lives. Decision-making under time pressure is well studied in psychology, and the findings are not encouraging. Cognitive load increases. Error rates increase. People default to familiar frameworks, even when those frameworks are poorly suited to the current situation. The 36-hour problem is not just logistical, it is human, and there is the warning fatigue factor. The CNMI and Guam have experienced typhoon warnings before. Most of them did not produce the worst-case scenario. Yutu did. Mawar mostly did not. The population is not naive about storms, far from it, but repeated cycles of warning, preparation, and then something less than catastrophe can erode the urgency that genuine catastrophic warnings require. Forecasters know this. They know that the more often extreme warnings are issued, and the storm underperforms the forecast, which happens for reasons entirely outside of forecaster control, the harder it becomes to communicate genuine urgency when a Sin Laku arrives. The insight that cuts through all of this is simple and uncomfortable. Forecast accuracy is essentially irrelevant if the timeline is too short to act on the forecast. Even if every meteorologist's prediction about Sin Laku is completely correct, the physical logistics of the island environment mean that the preparation gap closes before the response fully scales. Knowing precisely how bad something will be does not help if the knowledge arrives at the same time as the thing itself. There is one more population layer in this story that almost never appears in typhoon coverage, a community within the community that faces all of these vulnerabilities multiplied by structural disadvantage. The Compacts of Free Association, known as COFA, are agreements between the United States and 3 Pacific Island nations: the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. Under these agreements, citizens of those nations have the right to live and work in the United States and its territories without a visa. Over the decades since these compacts took effect, significant communities of COFA migrants have settled in Guam and the CNMI, attracted by proximity to their home islands, community networks, and economic opportunity relative to the options available in their countries of origin. These communities tend to settle in lower-cost housing areas, which in the geography of Guam and the CNM, means areas that are more exposed to flood risk and storm surge than better insulated, higher elevation, more structurally reinforced neighborhoods. Economic vulnerability and geographic vulnerability compound each other. The families least able to absorb the cost of rebuilding tend to be living in the structures least capable of withstanding the storm. Language presents a specific problem in emergency communication. Official emergency alerts, evacuation orders, shelter-in-place guidance, and post-storm instructions are issued primarily in English, with some Chamorro language materials. COFA communities speak Chukese, Marshallese, Pohnpeian, and other languages that may not be covered by official emergency communication systems. The information that could help a family make a life-saving decision in the hours before landfall may simply not reach them in a form they can fully understand. Transportation access shapes the evacuation picture further. Without vehicles, without the economic resources to purchase last-minute tickets on any available flights, without connections to the institutional networks that organize evacuation assistance, some COFA families face the storm with fewer options than their neighbors. They shelter in place, not as a choice between alternatives, but as the only option available. Disaster research consistently documents that recovery outcomes after catastrophic events are not evenly distributed across populations. Communities with more resources, more institutional connections, more documentation status certainty, and better access to government assistance programs recover faster than those without. This is not a post-Sin Laku prediction. It is a pattern documented across every major disaster event of the last several decades. The storm does not distinguish between the well-connected and the marginalized. The recovery system does, even when it does not intend to. This is the human face of the single-point failure architecture. It is not just ports and power grids that fail under catastrophic load. It is the equity infrastructure, the systems designed to ensure that help reaches everyone, that also faces its stress test. And that stress test is beginning now. Here is a test. In the past 24 hours, how many stories have you seen in your newsfeed about Super Typhoon Sin Laku bearing down on 170,000 American citizens? Now think about how many stories would be in your feed right now if a Category 5 hurricane, same wind speed, same pressure, same 36-hour approach timeline were headed directly for Miami. The difference between those two numbers is not explained by journalistic negligence or malicious editorial choices. It is explained by something more structural and, in some ways, more difficult to fix. American media coverage of disasters scales roughly with the proximity of those disasters to the concentration of the American media's core audience. The core audience is on the mainland. The mainland audience knows where Miami is. Most of the mainland audience, if we are being direct about this, would struggle to locate Guam on an unmarked map of the Pacific. This is not ignorance as a character flaw. It is ignorance as a function of distance, geographic, cultural, and historical. Guam and the CNMI have been American territories since 1898 and 1978 respectively, but their integration into the mainland American cultural consciousness has been limited. They appear in the military context, Guam as a Pacific defense hub, but the civilian communities, the Chamorro culture, the Carolinian traditions, the lives and livelihoods of the actual people who live there, are largely absent from the story America tells itself about itself. Atlantic hurricane coverage has decades of infrastructure behind it. Weather Channel hours, network stand-ups from Galveston to the Outer Banks, the famous footage of correspondents fighting wind and rain with a microphone in hand. These have built a visual and emotional vocabulary for Atlantic storms that simply does not exist for Western Pacific typhoons in American media. When Sin Laku makes landfall, there will be no network news anchor standing in Hagåtña, with wind-bending palm trees behind them in the live shot. There may not be live shots at all, because the communications infrastructure will be down. The feedback loop this creates is insidious. Low coverage generates low awareness. Low awareness generates less viewer demand for coverage. Less viewer demand justifies fewer resources devoted to covering events in the region, which produces lower coverage of the next event. Round and round. Resource allocation in emergency response follows public attention in ways that are not always explicit or intentional, but are consistently observable. The storms that get the most coverage get the fastest federal response narratives, the most congressional attention, the most sustained reconstruction funding. The storms that happen to people most Americans cannot easily locate on a map get a different experience. This is a systemic issue that digital media is beginning to alter at the margins. Citizen journalism, social media reporting from the affected communities, satellite internet coverage that persists where cable infrastructure fails. But the structural imbalance between Atlantic and Pacific coverage in American media remains real, remains consequential, and is, right now, actively shaping how seriously most of the country is taking the fact that the strongest storm on Earth is 36 hours from American soil. Which brings us to what happens when the wind finally stops. And that might be the most difficult part of this entire story. When the eye wall of a Category 5 typhoon arrives, it does not arrive gradually. The sky darkens. The wind builds through ranges that ordinary experience provides no reference point for. At Category 1, wind is dramatic and damaging. At Category 3, it is genuinely dangerous and structurally destructive. At Category 5, at 184 miles per hour, it is a different physical phenomenon. Objects that should be stationary become projectiles. Structures that were engineered to withstand wind loads encounter forces beyond their design specifications. Vegetation that has survived decades of typhoon seasons is stripped, broken, and in some cases entirely uprooted, leaving the landscape stripped bare in a way that changes the ground-level physics of subsequent wind exposure. The power grid, those 80% above ground lines, begins to fail in the outer bands, hours before the eye wall arrives. By the time the eye wall crosses, the grid failure is essentially complete for the affected areas. Communications infrastructure loses power. Cell towers switch to battery backup that has been pre-programmed to last hours, not days. The window of real-time communication from inside the storm zone to the outside world compresses as the storm's center approaches and then closes almost entirely as the eye wall passes. Storm surge arrives as the eye wall approaches from the ocean side. The sea level rise, driven by the low pressure, and the wind setup can push water inland at heights that overcome structures designed purely for wind resistance. Low-lying coastal areas, which in Guam's geography include significant residential and commercial zones, face a compound hazard. Destructive wind from above and rising water from below simultaneously. Emergency services, which are operating in their own compromised facilities under the same wind load, face a demand spike at exactly the moment their operational capacity is most constrained. The first 12 hours after the eye wall passes may be the most critical window in the entire disaster sequence. This is when injuries are being treated in facilities that have lost primary power. This is when structural collapses are being assessed in conditions that may still include dangerous winds. This is when the decision tree for post-storm response, triage, prioritization, communication with the outside world to begin requesting specific assistance must be executed by people who have just endured a Category 5 eye wall, possibly with no sleep, in facilities that are themselves damaged. The capacity of human beings to perform precisely and effectively in that window is not unlimited. The port and airport, which will both be shut down during the storm's passage, will require damage assessment before operations can resume. A runway with debris is not a functional runway. A port with damaged equipment and disrupted channel depths cannot immediately accept large cargo vessels. The gap between when the storm passes and when meaningful resupply begins is measured in days. What the population has on the day before landfall is largely what it will have to work with for the first several days of recovery. Let us end where all of this has been pointing, because the most important question here is not meteorological. Why do 170,000 American citizens live in a situation where the strongest storm on Earth arriving at their shore is treated as a regional story, a Pacific corner of the newsfeed, below the fold, easy to scroll past? This is not a mystery with a hidden answer. It is a transparency about a structural reality that most advanced nations prefer not to examine directly. The United States has territories, not states, territories, that have been part of the American political and legal system for over a century. These are places where American citizens live, pay taxes into federal programs, and serve in the military at extraordinary rates relative to their population size. And they exist at the intersection of geographic isolation, limited political representation, residents of Guam and the CNMI cannot vote in presidential elections, reduced media visibility, and disaster response systems that were designed with continental geography as the baseline assumption. Preparedness as a concept has always been partially a function of expectation. Communities prepare for what they believe might happen with the resources they can access, within the systems available to them. When those systems are slow, distant, and resource-constrained relative to the hazard environment, preparedness looks different than it does on the Gulf Coast. The gap between what good preparedness looks like and what is achievable with available resources is not a gap created by the residents of Guam and the CNMI. It is a gap created by decades of design choices made on the other side of the ocean. There is also a forecasting gap that Sin Laku has exposed again. Faster intensification means shorter warning windows. Shorter warning windows mean that even accurate forecasts arrive too late to fully leverage. If that gap widens, if storms intensify faster, more frequently, with less predictive lead time, then the current framework for issuing warnings and expecting communities to respond within those windows becomes increasingly inadequate as a safety system. The warning is not the same thing as the preparation. A warning that arrives during the storm's peak intensification, telling you that the storm is now stronger than yesterday's forecast, is not actionable preparation time. It is confirmation of something that is already beyond the preparation window. What Sin Laku represents, beyond its catastrophic wind speed and central pressure and 36-hour approach timeline, is a question about whether the systems that advanced nations build to manage catastrophic risk are keeping pace with the hazard environment those systems are supposed to manage. The honest answer, looking at the architecture of Guam's infrastructure, the geometry of Pacific disaster response, the structural inequities in emergency communication, and the media attention gap, the honest answer is not everywhere, not always, and not for everyone. The storm is coming. The wind will reach 184 miles per hour over American soil. 170,000 American citizens will experience it in real time, in the dark, without power, with limited communication to the outside world, across 5,000 miles of ocean from the mainland. And most of the country, scrolling through its newsfeed in the morning, will see nothing. Or perhaps one story, 3 paragraphs long, filed before the landfall by a wire service reporter who filed it from Honolulu. The invisible risk zones of advanced nations are not mysterious. They are the places we have decided, quietly and without explicit announcement, to pay less attention to. The storm does not share that decision. The storm goes where the water is warm, and the water does not care which communities we chose to notice. The question Sin Laku leaves behind, when the wind finally stops, when the power slowly comes back on, when the port reopens and the aid eventually arrives, is whether the next time a storm like this forms over this ocean, 170,000 American citizens will face it with something better than a single port, a single airport, 80% above-ground power lines, and the quiet hope that this time the mainland is paying attention. They deserve an answer to that question that is better than hope.